What beauty Borsus had could only be appreciated from the air. From the cockpit of the gunship Maxentius, Borsus was a crazed sculpture of steel, like an immense metallic expanse scrimshawed by a divine silversmith into a pattern too complex to reproduce. The features of the planet had been hurriedly named as the Astral Knights encountered them, and this area had been dubbed the Labyrinth Wastes. It was a stretch of iron plains carved deep with interlocking canals that served no apparent purpose save to form an impenetrable maze stretching between the horizons. Perhaps it was indeed a maze, and served as a defense to discourage besieging of the structure at the center of the Labyrinth Wastes. The slaves called it the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. From the cockpit of the Maxentius, Brother Cordelos could see why. 7 gleaming silver orbs circled around the peak of a great mountain-like structure, a cluster of pinnacles growing in height towards the center until the tallest spire reached past the orbiting spheres and touched the lowest edge of Borsus's cloud layer. The whole cathedral had the shape of a pyramid covered in spines, as if it was an enormous creature preparing for a predator's bite by sprouting hundreds of quills. Where everything around it was gray metal, the Cathedral of the Seven Moons was plated in ivory panels with flashes of the purple and sea green of the Wracked dynasty. The spears slowly orbited the peak of the cathedral, and Cordelos could make out sensor arrays and banks of lenses mounted on the polished curves of their surfaces. They were observatories, always peering through the cloud into the void. The Cathedral of the Seven Moons was the eye of Borsus. "I see troops massing along the southern edge," said Cordelos' co-pilot, Brother Felorn. Felorn had lost the upper half of his face and seemingly his capacity for joy and sense of humor. In a fuel leak and fire 10 years before, his twin bionic eyes were now just plugged directly into the gunship's control console, taking in the stream of information from its sensors. "Numbering 3 to 500. Support walkers and anti-grav artillery among them." "Then relay it to Strike Force Command," said Cordelos, as glowing runes were projected onto the cockpit's windows, overlaying the view with tactical information. Hundreds of red blips lit up around the cathedral's threshold. The Necron streaming out of the cathedral, identified and tagged by the gunship's cogitator. The gunship had been forged on Mars in an age when the more complex marks of cogitators were still being manufactured. The machine spirit of the gunship was agile and intelligent, and proved able to take in and calculate battlefield data far more quickly than a space marine. They did not make them like that anymore. They had not for several thousand years. Cordelos found himself hoping the Maxentius would make it off Borsus. The Imperium had the capacity to create new space marines. But when the Maxentius was gone, there would never be another. "You're coming over our position," voxed Captain Cabiar from below. The captain of the 9th was in overall command of the strike force. "I trust your mission was successful." "They were delivered intact. Not nearly as eventfully, and not nearly enough mayhem," replied Cordelos. "And you will be glad to know the enemy have all chosen to greet us at once." "How honored we are. I am glad we chose to return the favor." "Stay high and keep your eyes down. I need your intelligence for the moment, not your guns. I'll tell you when that changes." "Understood, brother captain." Cordelos could see the column of Astral Knights moving across the Labyrinth Wastes, directed through the dense steel canyons by their Auspex scanners and by the topographical maps being sent to them by Maxentius' machine spirit. From this height, they were no more than insects with white carapaces. That distant, tiny hint of movement represented the pride of Obsidia, the Emperor's finest, and thousands of years of glory, sacrifice, and war. The Astral Knights were making their last move of the war on Borsus. They were attacking Overlord Hekaroth in his own stronghold, the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. They were ending this fight one way or another. All of them. "Best of luck, my prince," voxed Captain Cabiar as he marched to war. Cordelos had been addressed that as many times among the Astral Knights, and always in that same mocking tone. And always he gave the same reply. "Same to you, peasant." The lightning rail had demonstrated to the Astral Knights the existence of mass transit on Borsus. It was the means by which the Necrons had moved their contingents of warrior constructs around the districts of the planet. Some of the slaves had been taken by the lightning rails from one set of laborers to the next, and were able to lead a team accompanied by Tech Marine Serikos to one of the interchange stations. Amrad had given orders for Serikos to seize control of the lightning rails. It did not need to be permanent, only long enough for the various strike forces to converge. Serikos worked fast, and Borsus' transport system was under the invaders' control for as long as it took the Necrons to respond. That was all the time Amrad's plan needed. The orders went out across the Vox to the surviving Astral Knights commanders, Kabyard and the force fighting its way out of the Chanatorium district, the stragglers making out of the necropolis, and the various knots of Astral Knights moving and fighting independently, and then the officers of Amrad's own strike force. They all knew what the orders signified. This was their last shot. They would return from this operation victorious, or they would not return at all. Amrad had learned from the slaves who betrayed Zahiros' mission. He kept the reasoning behind the operation to himself. Most of the Astral Knights guessed it, but they did not discuss it. There seemed to be no point. They had their orders, and they all knew what had to be done. They were to get to the closest lightning rail and ride it, with Serikos controlling from afar to the edge of the labyrinth waste. They were to muster at the waste under Kabyard's command, and with Cadelos directing them from overhead, march to the gates of the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. There, they were to kill Overlord Hekaroth. Whether Hekaroth's dying would deliver the destruction of Borsis, or whether it was to be done for simple revenge, the Astral Knights did not question. Their chapter master had spoken. They had their orders. "To red at 4, said Brother Phalorn. He need not have said anything, though. The threat icons of the Maxentius were bathing the cockpit in flickering red, and the runes projected onto Cadelos' retina depicted twin flashing daggers approaching the gunship from the side. "Banking, evading low. Get a lock and use missiles," said Cadelos. The Maxentius dropped out of the air, thrusters burning just long enough to arrest its fall above the surface of the labyrinth waste. The Astral Knights directly below scattered and instinctively aimed their bolters at the sky. Cadelos got his first glimpse of the enemy as twin crescent-shaped shadows arrowing across the mazework, banking and peeling off as they streaked past the Maxentius. "The sky is yours no more, alien," said Cadelos. He gunned the main engines and the Maxentius leapt off, arcing around to bring the enemy fighters into visual range. The fighters were of a similar design to the craft that had spiraled up at the Tempestus from the surface of Borsis, but smaller and more streamlined for agility to atmospheric flight. The middle section swiveled freely between the curved wings, and around the central cluster were arrays of Gauss blasters, with their charged coils trailing lashing arcs of green energy. There were no view screens or cockpits. These fighters had no pilots. They were constructs, like the skeletal warriors who waited in their thousands on the battlements. Targeting runes flickered across Cadelos' vision as Phalorn and the gunship's cogitator locked on to the Necron fighters. Cadelos felt the gunship shuddering around him as the missiles were shunted into the launchers. The launchers slid from the undersides of the Maxentius, and the gunship tried to yaw out of control as a sudden air resistance dragged it back. 3 missiles shrieked out of the gunship, drawing glowing contrails across the sky. A volley of dense Gauss fire hurtled back, ripping past the gunship as Cadelos wrenched the controls, and the Maxentius tumbled down out of the line of fire. "I am Prince Calvana Codelos Ban Rahanian. I am ready to die," said Cadelos, a mantra that was as automatic to him as pulling a trigger or taking the yoke of the aircraft. Cadelos directed Maxentius below the level of the ravine, flying the gunship down it as fast as he could drive it, and still retain control. Gauss fire burst and hammered against the lip of the ravine, and shards off fragmented metal pinged and boomed against the hull. "Pull up! We're too low!" said Phalorn. "They'll shoot us down. We are 1, they are 2. Make them chase us," replied Cadelos, as more lights flashed and the alarms chimed. "2 hits," said Phalorn. A moment later, the broken shape of one Necron fighter careened off the canyon wall just ahead. It flipped and spun as the power coils of its Gauss weapons fractured and spilled a sudden wash of glowing liquid energy, eating through the steel ravine wall so quickly it had dissolved down to the canyon floor by the time Maxentius had hurried past. The gunship shuddered with the secondary explosions that filled the canyon behind with blue-green fire. This was how it had been across the Bokuran Heights 100 years ago. Cadelos had heard the tales from his grandfather. Men had taken to the skies in flimsy constructions of steel and silk, firing repeater railguns at their enemies among the clouds. They were doomed men who took the defense of their name and their homeland as a personal responsibility, and sought death and honor dueling in the sky. Cadelos had dreamed of it, and those dreams had become suspended in his blood and remade him as a knight of the sky. His bloodline was horrified at the idea of their first and best son taking flight and risking everything up there. But then, they had never been forced to watch him do it. The Astral Knights had come to the palace before then and taken him to the fortress monastery where they had made him a prouder knight even than those fearless men of Obsidia's past. This was how it had been. Battle at the speed of thought, life and death, honor and failure, in less time than it took to blink. Pure conflict distilled and raw. Cadelos' heart were filled with it. He had been born for many things, but above all, he had been born for this. Through the billows of flame, the second fighter arrowed. Another glittering spray of gauss fire shimmered out from its central cluster, shooting past the Maxentius. Damage controls, warnings, and then they flashed. "Port controls veins, they're gone," said Valorn. The Necron fighter hurtled overhead, rising up into the sky above the labyrinth waste, hanging for a moment at the apex of its climb, and dropping back down again for another pass. "He's faster, I'll give him that," said Cadelos. He felt his jaw tighten as he focused everything he had on keeping the Maxentius weaving through the narrow labyrinth canyons, yanking it into right-angled turns and slewing sideways around the tighter bends. The Necron fighter was an interceptor craft. It was fast enough to keep pace with anything the Imperium had in a dogfight. But that meant it had to go fast. It couldn't slow down or hover in place like the Maxentius could. It could not stay on the gunship's tail in the confines of the labyrinth because its minimum speed forced it to overshoot the gunship after a few seconds. It cut down the Necron's opportunities of attack. Cadelos flew as fast as he could to keep the gunship as slippery as possible, jinking and sliding out of the Necron's sights, but it was still slow enough that the Necron was restricted to second-long bursts of fire before it had to rise back up and out of the canyon to loop down again for another pass. "We're coming up on target," said Valorn. "Turn back!" Cadelos realized the Maxentius was almost at the threshold of the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. The structure probably bristled with anti-aircraft Gauss weapons. He needed to keep well away from that mountain of death. "Two hostiles, high!" said Valorn. More runes and warnings flashed up, too many for Cadelos to keep track of. A lifetime of training and sleep indoctrination took over, and he entered a state where his mind instinctively noted in what was important and abandoned everything else. Some of the data coming his way, the weaponry indicators, damage control, fuel, targeting, could be left to Valorn. Much of it, altitude and attitude gauges. He flew entirely by eye and took in only the indicators of his enemy's location. Two more Necrons joined the first on their attack run. Cadelos threw the Maxentius in a sharp turn that took it down a narrow ravine over which ran a bridge of steel. The warrior constructs on the bridge were marching to join the defense of the cathedral. They turned their Gauss rifles towards the Maxentius as the gunship streaked under the bridge. Gauss cannon fire from the pursuing fighters hammered into the bridge and pocked the canyon walls. Maybe some of the warrior constructs had even been caught in the blast. The Necrons did not seem the kind of xenos that cared greatly about dissolving a few of their own to get at the enemy. The third fighter was more accurate, and Cadelos felt the gunship buck underneath him and jump around at the controls as if suddenly it was lighter. "Fuel breach! Full loss!" The damage control system activated pick screens on the console that showed the damage. A Gauss shot had eaten clear through the side of the gunship and into the fuel tank that straddled the fuselage. The last drops of the viscous fuel were spraying from the tear. "Bring us down!" "They'll strafe us. We need something overhead." The Maxentius could stay in the air for a minute or so. It had to be on the ground by then, but not somewhere the enemy fighters could swoop down on it at their leisure. A cave or an overhang where the Maxentius could skid to a halt without exposing itself to attack from overhead. There had to be something like that in the winding canyons of the labyrinth wastes. More fire. Cadelos spun the gunship down a ravine that zigzagged crazily. He felt the maneuvering thrusters weakening under him as he jinked through every turn. They could not keep him moving for more than a few seconds. Not like this. The gunship rounded a corner, juddering on failing columns of exhaust, and the massive front face of the cathedral loomed past the bend. This close, Cadelos could see the hundreds of towers that made up the cathedral, increasing in height towards the center, to form a mountain of steel spears covered in lights and engraved in hieroglyphs. An army of warrior constructs clustered around the towering gatehouses in a carpet of glittering steel. The shadows of the orbiting moons passing over the gathered Necrons. Cadelos could almost feel the thousands of Xenos eyes burned and looking towards the Maxentius. A shard of shadow broke off and rippled across the sea of metal skulls. Cadelos glanced up to see the Necron fighter swooping down past the nearest moon, breaking off to come at the Maxentius from three directions. A leader. A true leader, not just one with the right bloodline and metals, made decisions quickly and stuck by them. He did not turn back on them. He did not weigh up all the possible answers until the crisis had grown past the point of solving. Cadelos had been taught that in the halls of his fathers, and at the feet of the best tutors on Obsidia. And when the battle lore of the Codex Astartes told him much the same thing, Cadelos knew it to be true. The decision he made then was to point the Maxentius downwards, into the maw of the closest canyon opening, and force every remaining drop of fuel through the main engines. There was no landing safely. There was no hovering in place and shooting back. Trying to do either, or worse, both, would invite the Necrons to riddle the Maxentius with so much Gauss fire that there would likely be nothing left but scattered atoms. The only choice was to crash, and so Cadelos made that choice. Gaussfire punched through the body of the Maxentius. Part of the payload detonated, and the rear of the gunship was blasted clean off. The cold, damp air of Borsis whispered and whistled through the cockpit. The engine sputtered and died. The canyon wall hurtled past. The control surfaces and thrusters were gone, and Cadelos had no say over how the Maxentius fell. It slammed into the wall and bounced off, Cadelos' head snapping from side to side with such force he thought his neck would break and he would be dead before he hit the ground. The Maxentius landed on its side, the cockpit was crushed against the ground, and Phalorn vanished in a welter of crumpled metal. Fire and sparks spurted as the gunship skidded along the pitted ground. Cadelos could see nothing but random light in motion, feel nothing but his body being hammered from every direction, hear nothing but a deafening scream of steel on steel. The thought cut through everything, as if it was stamped onto his brain, and all the bedlam of the crash could not drown it out. I am Prince Calvana Kodelos Banrahenian. I am ready to die. That had been the question his grandfather asked of him when he was taken to the battlements, on the day of his ritual of majority. Was he ready to die? He had said he was, of course, and he had meant it. The Astral Knights chaplain had asked it of him when Cadelos was presented to him. His mother had pleaded with the chaplain not to take their young prince. He was born to one day rule over half of Obsidia, not to die fighting an alien war light years away. But his uncles had demanded her silence, and Cadelos had answered that he was ready to die that very moment, if it was the will of the Emperor and the requirement of his duty. I am ready to die. If Cadelos had been knocked unconscious, it had not been for long. Perhaps he had been awake through the whole crash. Perhaps 10 minutes had gone by, or maybe a few seconds. Cadelos could not tell. Again, the lessons of the dueling hall and the codex took over. Without thinking about it, Cadelos was clambering out of the ruined cockpit, through the shattered windshield and out across the nose. Smoke was pouring around him, and heat was pulsing up from the hole underneath. Fire was already rushing up from the shattered stern of the gunship towards the front. Cadelos jumped down onto the ground as the fire flowed through the cockpit and then over the nose. He ran to the relative safety of an overhang that he was vaguely aware reached out above him. He passed out of the zone of heat around the crashed gunship, and, as if recognizing the immediate threat was gone, his mind returned to him the responsibility for making decisions, along with the full range of his senses. Cadelos realized his twin hearts were hammering. He ordered them to be calm. He forced his breathing to do the same. His armor was scorched and dented, especially his left shoulder guard, which had been almost turned inside out. But he could feel no broken bones or ruptured organs. What pain he felt was the good kind, the bruised and wrenched joints that told him everything was still working. The Maxentius could come to rest in a shallow cave in the canyon wall that looked like it had naturally occurred through the centuries of corrosion. The steel was pitted and crumbling underfoot, and gritty metal stalactites hung down overhead. The wreck was still burning, but with its fuel and payload gone, there was nothing to explode. Beyond the cave, there was one bend in the canyon before the area immediately around the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. And of course, the thousands of Necron warriors who had seen him crash. A shape stumbled towards Cadelos, silhouetted in the flame. Cadelos recognized the shape of power armor, even as his hand went to the bolt pistol at his side.
Phalorn! I was sure I'd seen you die. I was thrown clear, Brother Cadelos,
said Phalorn. Phalorn was one of the few Astral Knights who had never sarcastically addressed him as Prince. He could see that Phalorn still had his sidearm, an Adeptus Astartes patterned shotgun of the type carried by the chapter scout units. Phalorn had done well to keep it on him during the crash.
Here we fight, brother. The xenos will have seen us come. They will be after us soon. Then our duty is to make them pay dearly for our deaths.
It could have been a quote from the Codex Astartes. Maybe it was. Phalorn had much of it memorized.
Brother, our steed is slain. We are disarmed. How can our duty be done now?
The defeatism of the words surprised him so much he wasn't sure he had said it. They had come without him willing, but they were true. Cadelos' duty was to fight the Astral Knights' battles in the air, dogfighting with enemy interceptors, strafing hostile troops, relaying information. Since he had earned his power armor, that was how he had fought, from above in the cockpit of the Maxentius. And now the Maxentius was gone.
We do our duty as the Codex demands,
said Phalorn. There was no inflection in his voice. How? How do I fight?
I was ready for my duty to kill me, brother. I would not be an Astral Knight if I was not, but I was supposed to die in the air. I should have died in a fireball above us, or in the crash. Not on the ground, naked like this. We take the deaths we are given. We must make do with the galaxy's choice of fate. Maybe a Prince of Obsidia is not used to making do.
Cadelos stared at Phalorn. It was the first time his battle brother had even mentioned Cadelos' status back on their homeworld. He was not sure if it was Phalorn's words that had taken him aback, or the fact that they might be true. The sounds of steel footsteps on steel reached Cadelos and he snapped out of his thoughts. Necron constructs were rounding the corner in the ravine outside the cave. Most were the basic warrior constructs, but they were backed up by immortals toting their double-barreled Gauss cannons.
They did not take long. Now is not the time for doubt. Brother Cadelos, give yourself to your anger. Fight and die. Give thanks to our task that it is so simple.
Cadelos did not have time for a reply. Gauss fire shrieked past the wreck and burst through the rear wall of the cavern. Stalactites were sheared from the ceiling. Cadelos slid into the cover of the wreck, and the heat from the burning steel hammering against him. Phalorn took cover at the cockpit end, glancing over the crumpled nose at the advancing constructs. Cadelos could see through the torn hull of the Maxentius, where the gunship's passenger compartment had been carved straight through by fire from the Necron fighter craft. The warrior constructs were firing to keep the Astral Knights' heads down, while the Immortals advanced behind them, silently waiting for their chance to open fire and finish the fight. Cadelos sniped a couple of bolt pistol shots. One shot rang off the side of a warrior construct's skull and the construct fell. But a few seconds later it clambered back to its feet, with one eyepiece burned out. More Gauss fire stripped away the other side of the Maxentius, boring through cover that became less and less secure with every second. He had learned to shoot among his uncles, who considered the best ability to hunt was the true measure of a man, and it was essential for anyone who would one day wear the threefold crown of Obsidia. They knew better than to try to stop him from flying, for he would one day have the power to promote or execute them at will. But they made sure he was well versed in the traditional pursuits of House Calvana, and the young Cadelos could shoot. Another couple of shots brought down the damaged Necron, punching through its neck and severing its metallic skull from its shoulders. Cadelos could hear Phalorn reloading his shotgun, replacing the close-range fragmentation shells with solid slugs, followed by a trio of shots that hammered into the chest of another construct and blew its torso open. It clattered to the ground, and though it was not deactivated, some crucial component was shattered, and it could only drag itself along the ground with one twitching arm. It was not like hunting. Then the prey fell and stayed still, and was picked up by a retriever hound or one of the house staff when the shooting was done. The constructs could take a bolter wound and get up again, and when one did stay still, there was always another construct behind it ready to take its place. These fickle thoughts were the doubts of a child, thought Cadelos as he took aim again and let the old warrior instincts depress the trigger. He had not felt this way since the Astral Knights had sent him out to bring back the head of a mutant from the equatorial jungles, armed only with a combat knife. Then he had been dizzied by the break from the court of House Calvana, and the suddenness for which he had been thrown into a world of danger and privation. He felt like that now, as if it were only yesterday he had been the center of a prince's world. No, it was not his life on Obsidia that had gone. It was his life in the cockpit of the Maxentius. That was what had been torn away so suddenly. He wasn't a pilot anymore, dueling in the sky. He was just like everyone else. The Immortals were in range. Cannon fire shredded the side of the ruined gunship. In a few seconds half the wreck was gone, and what remained was a crumbling mass of holes held together by strips of a dissolving rust. The warriors reached the wreck. One clambered on top to fire down at the two Astral Knights. Phalorn blasted its central mass apart with 2 shotgun rounds. Another rounded the nose, and Phalorn smacked it down with the butt of his shotgun. Cadelos shot the construct through the skull and pivoted to put another 3 bolt shells into the body of another lurching past the gunship's stern. There were too many. Even if every shot was a kill, the warrior constructs would kill the Astral Knights before the Immortals even got the chance. This was not the death of the Astral Knights. This was not the death they had promised him, Prince Calvana Cadelos Bandrahanian. Not this pointless butchery. His duty was not done. And he was on the ground, dying for nothing in a skirmish that won no plaudits and contributed to no victory. This was not a Space Marine's death. Brother Phalorn wrestled the warrior construct to the ground, but in doing so his back was exposed. Another construct leveled its Gauss blaster and fired a bolt of green energy right through the backpack of Phalorn's armor, stripping out a core of ceramite straight down to the back of his ribcage. A second shot punched the rest of the way through, and Phalorn slumped on top of the fallen construct. His hearts, lungs, and spine had been obliterated. He was dead. Cadelos backed away from the wreck as the constructs marched forward. Gaussfire streaked past him. One bolt clipped his shoulder guard, and he felt hot pain there, where it stripped away a furrow of skin and muscle. Cadelos was firing, but it was not a conscious decision to pull the trigger or swap out a new magazine when the hammer fell in an empty chamber. His mind was full of the futility of his death. Phalorn was gone, but Space Marines fell in battle. He was not the first on Borsus, and he would definitely not be the last. But Cadelos had been marked out for greater purpose. Was that not why the Emperor had seen him born into the line of House Kavana's princes? Why he had been endowed with the skill and willpower required by an astral knight? How could all that be a coincidence if he was just to die here in this cave like a rat instead of in the sky in a glorious fireball? His sacrifice is the keystone of victory. He had never let those thoughts take him full form. Never. He had never dared. But now, he could not hold them back. He was better than this. It was not supposed to end this way. An immortal stalked through the crumbling remains of the Maxentius. The gunship was now nothing more than a spider's web of crumbling steel, and it fell apart as the immortal brushed aside the wisp of its hull. The immortal leveled the twin barrels of its Gauss cannon at Cadelos. Cadelos fired, but the bolter's shots pinged uselessly off the construct's armored chestplate. The power coils of the Gauss cannon glowed as they made ready to fire. Until suddenly, a volley of bolter shots ripped into the immortal from the side. Its head was blown half away, and its leg was severed. It toppled to the side, and the fat bolt of energy from its Gauss cannon flew wide, dissolving a patch of the cavern wall behind Cadelos. Warrior constructs turned to face the assault, but more bolter fire hammered into them, and they were swept away as if by a sudden hurricane wind, shredded and dashed against the ravine wall. A squad of Astral Knights jumped down into view. Cadelos recognized the livery of the 3rd Company. Their sergeant's armor had the white flashes of a veteran, the first sergeant of his company. Ridiculously, Cadelos found himself searching his memory for the man's name, as if that was important here.
Sergeant Kapsala! My prince lives! The peasants rejoice! We saw you come down here. We didn't think anyone could have survived.
My co-pilot fell, said Cadelos. His thoughts still so muddled it felt like someone else was speaking with his voice.
Then he will be mourned. But not yet. We are making the final push. Caviar is bringing most of us down the middle. We're moving around to flank. Will you join us, Prince Cadelos? The Royal Seal is just what this operation needs.
Without waiting for an answer, one of First Sergeant Kapsala's squad threw Cadelos a bolter, a customized model with twin ammunition hoppers instead of a magazine slot, and a scope with 3 cycling lenses.
Look after her,
said the brother who had thrown it. He carried a meltagun as his main weapon, the perfect tool for cutting through warrior construct bodies at close range. Kapsala led a strike force of several units from different companies, fast-moving tactical units not slowed down by heavy weapons. They followed the ravine towards the cathedral. More construct units were moving towards the crash site, only to walk into a wall of bolter fire that the Astral Knights threw out without breaking stride. Cadelos stayed beside Kapsala's squad, and he could hear the sound of heavy bolters and missile launchers firing from the direction of the cathedral, and of Gauss fire streaking out in response. He looked up to see one of the 7 moons passing overhead, the electronic eye set into the sphere swiveling downwards to watch them. Hekaroth knew they were coming. He had probably known as soon as he reached the Cathedral of the 7 Moons that the Astral Knights would have to face him there. It was the only way to finish the fight on Borsus, and the Overlord knew it. Was this a better way to die? In the shadow of the cathedral facing thousands of warrior constructs? Cadelos did not know. He could not fish out coherent thoughts from this mind. Everything had changed so suddenly in the last few minutes. He felt like Prince Cadelos was gone, and a new man had appeared in his place, experiencing Borsus for the first time.
Spread out! Keep moving, hit hard!
Ordered Kipsala over the Vox as his squad led the way around the ravine corner which still smoldered from the fiery descent of the Maxentius. The Cathedral of the 7 Moons loomed into sight. From ground level, it was impossible to imagine such a place ever falling to an enemy force. The cathedral was like a confluence of everything that made Borsus so appalling, and such an impossible place as it was. The soaring pinnacles drew the eye upwards towards the zenith, where the topmost spires were lost amongst the clouds. The place seethed like a hive of insects, with warrior constructs along the walls and millions of scarabs flowing from the archways. The upper levels were dominated by an enormous hangar openings from which the fighter craft must have emerged. Every surface was carved and undulating, as if turned on lathe. The 7 moons had turned their eyes downwards, 7 huge telescope arrays peering down at Hekaroth's doorstep. The main strike force had rolled right up towards the front door of the cathedral, a gatehouse with a set of double doors 3 stories high. Kabyard had sent in the Devastator units of his 9th Company, anchoring a firing line with tactical units on the flanks. Half a chapter's worth of Space Marines formed an armored wedge, grinding under the Devastator's fire. So dense it looked like they were marching under a sky of las blasts and missile contrails. Opposing them was a phalanx of thousands of warrior constructs marching in perfect formation. They formed a rectangle 50 constructs deep, the front ranks firing a constant sizzling curtain of gauss fire. The constructs were being gunned down in their scores, the fire eating through the front ranks and deep into the center of the formation. But the Necrons did not care. There were more of them coming, and they had warriors to spare.
"Onward!"
came Kabyar's voice over the vox. Cadello spotted Kabyar leading the advance. The banner of the 9th Company was unfurled now, riddled with smoking gauss blasts, carried over the foremost point of the advance. Kabyar was beneath it, already surrounded by a heap of shattered constructs. From gateways opening up in the ground floor of the cathedral came more Necrons, kept in reserve until the Astral Knights made their play. Massive 3-legged war constructs, the walkers as the slaves had called them, stepped over the rear ranks of the warriors, spraying lashing whips of incandescent particles onto the Astral Knights. Canoptic spiders floated behind the phalanx, taking up fallen constructs and shredding them, regurgitating the reclaimed metal as swarms of voracious scarabs. From another port emerged an anti-grav throne, piloted by a pair of warrior constructs plated in gold and purple lacquer. Carried on the throne was a Necron noble, its headdress like a pair of gilded horns curving down over its shoulders, its decorated torso and shoulder guards inlaid with the colors of the Nephrekh dynasty. It pointed as voxcasters mounted on the throne blared orders in a grating machine tongue. Ranks of immortals followed its throne, and its movements were shadowed by a close-knit formation of Triarch, Praetorians, and Lynchguard.
"There! Hit the noble!"
ordered Kabyar. He barely needed to give the order at all. Kabyar's force, almost 40 Astral Knights of veteran and assault units, scrambled to charge across the wreckage-littered ground. A wing of the phalanx turned to bring their gauss blasters to bear on the flanking force, but the return fire ripped through them as Astral Knights fired on the run. Cadellos let out the bolter in his hand, and he made it fight. It was well balanced, and the action was so smooth he barely felt the recoil. Battle brothers from one of the assault squads charged past Cadellos into the phalanx. Chainblades sprang sparks as they carved into the bodies of the warrior constructs. Kipsala broke through the phalanx, and the noble's anti-grav throne lay ahead, pivoting to bring its mounted gauss cannon to bear. A stalker walked into Kipsala's path, and his squad scattered, the particle whip lashing across the ground between them. Cadellos fired up at the glinting red eyes mounted on the stalker's low-slung head. It turned and took a step towards him. Cadellos ran past its leg and rolled under it as the particle whip gouged a deep scar into the ground behind him. Bolter fire hammered up into the stalker. A las cannon shot from across the battlefield bored through its hull, and it slumped down onto one of its knees. The strike force kept moving and shooting even as the throne's gauss fire shot down one of Squad Kipsala and sliced through the leg of one of the assault brethren. Cadellos followed Kipsala to the throne. Kipsala grabbed a handhold and swung himself up. One of the construct pilots wrestled with him as Cadellos followed the sergeant up onto the throne. The borrowed bolter in his hand blew the second pilot constructs apart as the Necron noble descended from its seat, the staff in its hands crackling with power. The mouth slit of its face was a grill worked into a permanent snarl. It had one eye, a red orb set into the middle of its forehead. Cadellos tried to blast at it from close range, but the power staff batted his bolter aside. The Necron grabbed Cadellos by the throat, and he could feel the pincer grip of its steel hand bucking, the armored seal protecting his neck. Kipsala blasted the Necron's other arm off at the point-blank range. A chainsword lanced in from behind Cadellos and chewed through the ruins of its shoulder. The noble reared back, and Cadellos forced himself out of its grip. He rattled bolter fire into it before 2 more Astral Knights fell on it and ripped it apart with chain blades. The throne tilted, and Cadellos slid back down to the ground. The orders blared from the throne's voxcasters suddenly became a metallic scream.
"It fears us!"
Captain Kabyar was yelling over the vox. Cadellos could just see the banner of the 9th Company flying in tatters at the heart of the battle line.
It sends everything it has, but it will not be enough. The Overlord of Borsis fears us. We have taught the machine to know dread!
The inside of Cadelos' head was still a whirl. The constant din of gauss blasts and bolter fire hammered at him. To a space marine, they should have been no more than disruptions in a light breeze. But again, it seemed Cadelos was inside someone else's body, hearing their thoughts from somewhere else. Everything he had knew, everything was gone. He had not died a knight of the sky. He had not died a prince. The air above the battlefield shimmered and tore as if reality had been struck a blow, and the purple-black bruise of abnormality was spreading. From the disruption emerged 3 huge blocky shapes, hanging impossibly in the air. Each was a roughly rectangular block several meters high, topped by a glowing green crystal with arcs of power placing off it. Each corner of the floating machines had a particle whip weapon that fired down at the advancing astral knights. But that was not the real threat. The slaves called them monoliths, the sentinel constructs of the Necrons. Hekaroth had only a few to call on and was loath to deploy them. They were deadly war machines, but they were far more valuable to him as conduits through the information architecture of Borsis. In unison, one side of each monolith slid aside, revealing a zone of rippling space, like a surface of water held vertically. It seemed to Cadelos that each zone held a half-glimpsed interior far more extensive than the monolith's size could allow. From this indistinct space marched the distorted shapes of more warrior constructs. When the first constructs emerged from the monoliths, Cadelos saw they were much more ornate than the regular warrior ones, and walked upright instead of haunched. Their manner of decoration was different to the Lynchguard and Praetorians. They did not wear the color of any dynasty. Their bodies were plated with bronze. Each carried a halberd with a green crystal blade. The new constructs dropped down into the middle of the battlefield and set about carving into Cabiar's advance. Bolter fire rattled off them and their blades cut through power armor, slicing heads from bodies. The monoliths did not stop disgorging their cargo. Hundreds of the bronze Necrons dropped down onto the battlefield. Thousands. The torrent seemed as if it would never end. A throne drifted from one monolith, then another, carrying nobles in the same bronze livery.
The temple troops?
Said Kipsala in amazement. Cadelos realized why the Astral Knights had made their assault on the Cathedral of the Seven Moons. Their desperate, futile assault that could never possibly succeed. He knew why his chapter master had decided to give Hekaroth the pitched battle that the Overlord had been seeking ever since the Astral Knights had arrived on Borsis. It all made perfect, awful sense. And his death meant something after all.
I am Prince Kelvana Kodelos Bandrahenian. Who will follow me?
The mission he had completed before joining Cabiar's assault made sense. The choice of the cathedral as the target made sense. It all did. Cadelos could not help but smile as he ran at the newly reinforced Necron phalanx, bolter blazing. The Astral Knights nearby joined him, because for all they might claim to renounce their family obligations when they joined the Astral Knights, they were still sons of Obsidia, and he was still their prince. Cadelos leapt into the fray. A bronze temple construct turned to face him. Cadelos slammed into it with all his weight, wrenching its halberd around and blasting half of its skull away with his bolter. There were still more reinforcements pouring from the monoliths, but it did not matter. His duty was clear at last. Fight here and die. It was good to know his purpose again. It was good to be so certain. Doubt had no place in a space marine's mind, and now it was gone. Cadelos knew absolutely what would happen now. When his bolter shells ran out, he would fight with his combat knife. When his combat knife shattered, he would fight with his bare hands. And he would die atop a heap of the slain enemy, just like in every legend of the space marines. Cadelos welcomed it as the Necrons pressed closer, and every one promised him a prince's death.